Our speaker today needs no introduction to most of you, and probably not to most of the people in Massillon either. For years, he's been setting up this room for our brown bag lunches, so he gets to be up in the front. But although I try to rarely schedule a speaker for a second time, I was shocked a couple weeks ago when he told me that he has already been our speaker 12 times. And you're still here.
They're still here. That's
amazing. I wasn't intimating that you couldn't listen. But they've all been educational and entertaining. Chris is a graduate of the College of Worcester and did postgraduate work at both Kent and the University of Akron. He has a master's degree in art education. He taught art and American history in fearless schools for 31 years. That's one over the length that most teachers survive. And he was also adjunct teacher at Malone University. During Chris's 21 years here at the Massillon Museum, he's accomplished incredible things, but I'm pretty sure I can speak for him that his biggest accomplishment was co-founding and managing the Artful Living and Learning program, which today serves 3,000 preschoolers every week. Pretty amazing program. Time to sit back and enjoy Chris's dramatic presentation, we know it will be, and his insightful story of the inception of the American Revolution. Chris.
Thank you, Margie. Margie and I discussed this way back, and she said, you know, I'd really like to do something because it is the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. And so she contacted me because she wanted firsthand accounts. So, it is the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And as we came in here today, or when we set up for this today, I was working with Brandon on downloading the PowerPoint presentation, which I have to thank Valerie Metzger for doing. Valerie is our new curator. Stand up and say hi, Valerie. So yes. Because my technological abilities do rate or date to the American Revolution. So yeah, she did that for me and I deeply appreciate it. The other thing I wanted to tell you was Brandon gave me this little toy. And this thing is so cool, watch. Woo. So I'm going to be using that, definitely. First thing I would like to do, though, is draw your attention to that right there, America 250, because it is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolutionary War. The United States of America is promoting events all over the country. Every state will have their own promotions and their own events that will celebrate their participation as a state in the United States of America. And all this began last weekend. So there's a reason we're doing this today. And that is because last weekend commemorates the 250th anniversary of the first battles of the American Revolution, the battles of Lexington and Concord. And it was a huge event at Lexington and Concord. And they say they had over 100,000 people. I'm not sure of that. I didn't count them, so I don't know. I did see a lot of things online. How many have seen the events of these last weekend online on Facebook and that sort of thing? I see one or two hands. Yes, if you look it up, you're going to find there's a lot going on. And by the way, what you can do is go online and search for Battle Road events, Lexington reenactments, Concord reenactments, that sort of thing. Paul Revere's Ride. They had at the Old North Church, they had thousands upon thousands of people for Paul Revere's Ride. And then yesterday, Paul Revere actually participated in the Boston Marathon, and they had him riding the horse across the finish line. I think he won. He himself did not run because he had bad shoes. So he had to ride the horse instead. So, yeah, I'm sorry. But yeah, it was rather neat to see. And that was online as well, and some of the news broadcasts as well. But this is going to be going on for a very long period of time because the American Revolution went on for 8 years. Now, I don't know how long the 250 events will go on, but I can guarantee you that in 14 months, when it is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, you're going to see a lot going on about that. That is very, very, very important. So, as I was researching for this, I was overwhelmed by what was involved in this. This is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolutionary War, not the American Revolution. And I say that because of this. The Revolution and the Revolutionary War are two entirely different things. There must be a revolution before there will be a Revolutionary War. Why do I say that? Well, the American Revolution probably started in 1619 at Plymouth Colony or Jamestown. And why did it happen? A revolution is a change in the mindset of the people. That's what a revolution is, okay? And without that change in the mindset of the people, there's not going to be a change in the nation, all right? So you have to have that before you can have the Revolutionary War. So a revolution first takes place in the minds of the people. A Revolutionary War is a physical attempt to overcome a resistant power to the revolution. And when you think about the American Revolution, the resistant power was the British government. The revolution had already taken place in the mind of the people. When I used to teach this in high school, I tried to make it easy for my students, and so I told them, the Revolutionary War is the period at the end of the sentence, because the sentence has to come first, and then you have the ending period. And that's the way it happened. Why did it happen that way in the United States or in America? It happened that way out of necessity and out of beneficial neglect. Think about that a minute. Necessity, okay. So the colonists came over in 1619, 1620, and then on into the 1700s as settlers in a new world. They were 6 to 8 weeks from any help. So when they landed on this continent, they had to do it themselves. Self-reliance. You either did it or you died. The strong survived, the weak died. That will start changing your mind about life. They couldn't look to England or France or Holland or any of those European countries for immediate help. You had to do it yourself. All right? So necessity. And that included self-government. That's why you had the Mayflower Compact in 1619. That's why you had the beginnings of the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1619 and all that. Self-government. And you did it without the mother country. The mother country, in the case of Great Britain, since we're talking about the American Revolution, the mother country looked at the colonies as a cash cow. It got money. It got needed supplies and cotton and tobacco and rice and indigo from the colonies. That's what it looked for to the colonies. Other than that, it pretty much left the colonists do as they pleased. And that is beneficial neglect. And they got used to it. We were a little bit like spoiled children, okay, by the time of the Revolutionary War, because we'd been left alone so long that when the British government finally came in and said, wait a minute, you need to start doing things the way we want you to do it, we're like, oh yeah? I don't think so. All right, how did that happen? Well, let's look. Right there is the fuse that lit the bombs of the American Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War, the War for Empire. It's called the 7 Years' War in Europe. By the way, George Washington had a lot to do with that. He fought in the French and Indian War. The problem was the French and Indian War, since it was a world war for the British and the French, cost a lot of money. As a result of it, the British Empire defended the colonies so the French could not take over, and eventually won the war, encompassing all of North America for the British. Cost a lot of money. Well, their idea was, okay, we helped you out. We got you this continent. The French are going to leave you alone. We need you to help pay the bill. Hence, all the taxes. And I'm not going to go through all that, but you can look at it. So these taxes were to help Great Britain recoup the cost of the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War. That was the intent. The colonists did not like that because guess what? The taxes were being passed through Parliament in England without any representation of the colonies themselves. Taxation without representation. That's where that came from. And you can see the dates of each one of these come and go. And for each one of these, there was a reaction from the colonies. And a couple of them we didn't put in, but I do want to get down here, right here. Tea Act, 1773, Boston Tea Party, which cost the British millions of dollars. As a result of that, they passed the Intolerable Acts. They closed the port of Boston. If you committed a crime in Boston, you had to go to England to stand trial. Quartering Act. As they sent troops to Boston to keep you under control, you had to house those troops and you had to support those troops. And the one that really got them was they suspended or ended the Massachusetts Assembly. You guys no longer have any control over your own government. And that resulted in the Suffolk Resolves, which said, you know what? Colonists, be prepared to go to war. And it was an illegal Congress. And for a while, it was meeting in Concord, Massachusetts. Couldn't meet in Boston because British troops occupied Boston since 1768. Interesting stuff. So that brings us up to today, 1775. But before we get to that, Massillon did have a role in the American Revolutionary War. And if you were here last month, we mentioned a couple of these. The Roach family from Kendall, Thomas and Charity Roach's father owned two, I think it was father, where's Mandy? Mandy's back there talking to Alex, I tell you what, you know, kids, pay attention. Mandy, was it father or grandfather? Father. Owned two of the ships. One of them was the Beaver, the other one was the Dartmouth. Oh, they had three? Oh, do you know the name of the third one? Oh, okay. Funny name for a ship. Nope. Okay. So, but it was millions of dollars worth of tea was disposed of into the harbor. Okay. So Massillon had a role in that indirectly through the Roach family. Then down here, when I first came to Massillon, to the Massillon Museum, and here it is. Somebody going to do this? We've got this here to show you. So Kiara, our new collections manager, wave, okay, is going to bring this around and show it to you, but it is the handle and the beginning of an eyepiece for a glass that you would use to read with. And the neat thing about it is it says G-E-N-C Lee. All right, who was that? General Charles Lee was a general officer in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And he vied for Washington, with Washington, to be in control of the Continental Army. He wanted to be in charge. He was the second highest ranking military officer in the Continental Army. If you've never heard of him, you need to look him up. Interesting character. Interesting character. How we got that, why we have that, I have no idea. In addition to that, I believe we have a straight razor that also belonged to General Charles Lee. Now, I have done research because the straight razor I found in the Civil War collection. Good, it says Lee on it, you know. So everybody thought it belonged in the Civil War collection. But no, there were no General C. Lees in the American Civil War on either side. So that made me think, well, the only other General C. Lee is Charles Lee of the American Revolution. Is that definitive proof? No. But it's good enough for us. For me, I should say. I shouldn't say good enough for us. I'll get in trouble. So anyway, but yes, Massillon played a role in this. And in 1779, the American Army under Washington put a series of forts across the West with the intent of driving the British out of Detroit. One of those was Fort Lawrence, and that's less than 10 miles from here. And I rather imagine there will be some serious events at Fort Lawrence in a few years. Well, they do events every year anyway. So if you want to see some very high quality living history, go to Fort Lawrence. All right. Oh, well, look who we have, and here I go. Listen, my children, and you will hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April of 75, nary a man is left alive who remembers that famous date and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern above I'll get it right. Hang a lantern, I told you I'd mess this up. Hang a lantern above the arch of the North Church tower as a signal light. One if by land, two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride, and spread the alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. And then he said, good night. Now, folks, I've done 3 verses of this poem. It's 33 verses long. And you can see I had trouble with that one. It was written it's a rather long poem, and it was written by a rather long fellow. Thank you. But as you can see, I'm a rather old fellow, and I have a deteriorating and very short memory. So the recitation that I just messed up is probably all of it you're going to hear from me. Because as much as I've tried, and I've done my best, for the life of me, I cannot remember any more of it. Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a silversmith. He was a metalsmith in Boston. He had a shop in Boston. He was an avid patriot. He was part of the alarm system, which is why the poem by Longfellow. He did quite well after the war. And by the time, 20 years later, he had a foundry. Not just a shop, but a foundry. And he is responsible. I thought this was very interesting. He had a foundry which produced all the metalwork, copper and brass and bronze metalwork for the USS Constitution. So if you go to the ship USS Constitution, all the metalwork was done by the Revere foundry. And then in 1803, he produced all the plating for the copper bottom of the USS Constitution as well, which I thought was very interesting. He was an avid patriot, as I said. He was also a propagandist. And this is an engraving he did of the Boston Tea Party, and pretty well done. He's got the human form pretty well, and he has, and I'm an art teacher, and he has linear perspective pretty well down, so he was a pretty good artist as well. And of course, he did this as propaganda against the British and produced these in great numbers to affect people's attitudes toward the occupation of Boston by the British. He did not ride alone. He was accompanied by William Dawes, and we don't hear much about that. But the colonial alarm system was absolutely awesome. When they knew that the British were coming out of Boston to find military supplies and destroy those military supplies, they went out and all they had to do was let a few people know. And it was very interesting what happened because it was almost like the branches of a tree. Once the alarm got out into the public, then everybody got on board and they would go to their neighbors. They would fire muskets in the air. They would ring church bells. Whatever they could do, beat drums, beat kettles to let everybody know this is an alarm. And they set this up because the British in Boston came out several times looking for military supplies. And in fact, the alarm system they developed was so good, they had used it during the French and Indian War as well. So they brought it up again before the American Revolution so that people would not be surprised. So he was just one person in a very large system of alarm. I wanted to show you this. This is the Old North Church. Up there is yep, that's where the lanterns were at. And then Revere, by the way, over the weekend, they had lanterns in that all weekend, 2 lanterns in that all weekend at night. And they posted that online as well. Of course, this is the Revere statue outside of the Old North Church. This I thought was very interesting. This is one of the 2 original lanterns that were used to tell Revere whether the British were coming by land or by sea. They don't know where the second one is, but this one is in the Concord History Museum in Concord, Massachusetts. I think that's just awesome that they still have that. I think it's wonderful. So here we have a map. Why? Was it important for them to know if the British were coming by land or by sea? Well, if you look at the map of Boston, you see that. At the time, Boston had about 7,000 people. In addition to that, it had 4,000 British troops. So that was Boston at that time. Today, Boston, of course, is like way out here. But at that time, that's Boston. Look around Boston. It's completely surrounded by water except for right there. That's called Boston Neck. And that was its only connection to the mainland. If the British had marched down the neck to go to Concord, they would have had to come up around here. It would have added another 3 or 4 miles to their march. So they went across by water quicker. And that was important in the alarm to let people know that they were coming by water, so it would be sooner. So Revere came this way, well, up this way, and Dawes came this way, and they're warning people all along the march, and they are stopped just beyond Lexington by a patrol, a mounted patrol of British soldiers who took their horses and also roughed them up a little bit. And so they're left without horses. They had to walk back to Lexington. That's as far as they got. So we hear about Paul Revere because of the Longfellow poem, but we don't hear about Dawes. And neither one of them got to Concord, which was where the British were going. Another rider that joined them in Lexington, a man by the name of Samuel Prescott, joined them here. He made it to Concord and let Concord know that the British were coming. General Gage, who was in command in Boston, received orders from Parliament that he was to disarm the militia, the colonial militia. They were going to try to prevent warfare by taking away the arms. That was the intent. So he designated Colonel Smith and 700 troops to cross over at midnight on the 18th of April and march to Lexington and then on to Concord, where they thought there was a lot of military weapons and supplies. The Patriots, the militia, the colonials, had a spy system. They already knew they were coming. So as Smith and his men were marching up through here, they heard all the alarms. They heard the church bells. They heard the drums. They heard the guns and all that. And Smith said, they already know we're coming. So he sent for reinforcements. I'm going to need more troops. But they continued their march up to Lexington. By the time they got to Lexington, the Lexington militia knew that they were there, that they were coming. And the Lexington militia had already assembled in the Buckthorn Tavern in Lexington. So they were ready for them. There were about 80 under the command of John Parker. This is Lexington Green. We're looking at it from the point of view of the British. When the British got to Lexington, they saw Parker and his men formed up right across here. This monument, which is the oldest monument in the United States, it was installed in 1799 to the men who were killed at the Lexington fight, marks the right of the militia line. So they were facing us out across here. There were about 80 of them. The number varies, but it was about 80. The British decided, the first two companies of British formed in line to confront the colonials. John Parker, who was the commander, said, hold your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they want a war, let it begin here. So as they were standing there facing each other, a British officer rode up to the militia and said, rebels, disperse, disperse, rebels. Damn you rebels, throw down your arms and disperse. Parker actually gave the command to break ranks and disperse because he wanted no confrontation. He was greatly outnumbered, more than 2-to-1 from the companies that were facing him of British. So they started to move away. Somewhere, and to this day, nobody really knows where it came from, there was a shot. Some say it came from behind a tavern. Some say that it was a British officer discharging his pistol. They don't know. But nobody in Parker's militia company fired a shot. Immediately after that shot was fired, one of the companies of British, without orders, opened fire with a ragged volley without command. They fired first. Then the second company of British troops fired an organized volley into the militia. 8 militia were killed, 10 were wounded. That's it for Lexington. That's the entire action at Lexington. The British reformed their ranks, went back to the road, and continued their march to Concord. That was the Battle of Lexington. Now you're looking at the fight from the point of view of the militia, the Lexington militia. This is Buckthorn Tavern right here, where they were formed up to begin with. But that's it. That's the entire Battle of Lexington. Okay? From Lexington, they marched on to Concord. By the way, if you look at the key, and this is really, I think, very important, the distance from here to Lexington is approximately 10 miles. The distance from Lexington to Concord is an additional 5 miles, 15 miles. The British started about midnight. They got to Lexington about 5 o'clock in the morning. They then marched on to Concord. And again, because of the great alarm system that the colonials had put in place, they knew they were coming. And they already had 200 militia in Concord waiting on them. Now, the British had 700. All right? So the Concord militia marched out toward the British to begin with and saw that they were vastly outnumbered. So they turned around and they went back into Concord and then up to the North Bridge, went across the North Bridge to a hilltop where they could stand on the hilltop and see what the British were doing because they were outnumbered. They didn't want to get into a fight with the British. The British came to Concord, 700 troops. They divided up into companies. One company went to the South Bridge to guard the bridge here. One company stayed back on the road to guard their rear. Another company went to farms, local farms, to look for military supplies. And a last company went up to the North Bridge, went on this side of the bridge to guard that bridge against the militia. The rest of the British troops stayed in Concord, searching the town for military supplies. Now, their orders were not to burn houses, barns, not to do any depredations at all against the populace. You're there to destroy military supplies. That's it. Go out there, destroy the supplies, come back to Boston. That was the order. They did find some military supplies, but most of it had already been dispersed to other towns. They took what they found out into the middle of the street and set it on fire. The militia up here suddenly sees smoke in town and thinks the British are burning the town. So they march down. By now, there's 400 of them because militia are coming in from everywhere because of the alarm system. So now they have 400 militia. They march down to the bridge where there are only 90 British troops. The British troops very quickly go to the other side of the bridge as the militia comes close to the bridge, and then they turn around on the other side of the bridge and fire at the approaching colonials. 2 colonials were hit and killed instantly. 2 more are wounded. The commander of the militia says, "Fire, men, fire, fire," which they do, killing 2 British troops and wounding 2 others. That's it for Concord. That's the Battle of Concord right there. The British retreat back into town where the other 500 troops are, and they decide, since they have marched 15 miles, they need to take a break. They need to reorganize. They need to rest for the return trip to Boston. Huge mistake. Huge mistake, because what that did was give the militia, colonial militia, time to get more troops, more of their people in place, which they did. And more and more and more are coming because of that alarm system. They are placing themselves all along the road between Concord and Lexington. And as the British finally decide it's time to march back to Boston, all along the road, they're being ambushed by companies of militia. And it would be, a militia group would be in the woods, and as the British marched by, they would just fire into them. And then they'd run away. And then they'd go another 50 yards, and then a group of militia on the other side of the road would fire into them. There were single riflemen acting on their own, but generally speaking, it were companies of colonial militia that were organized and trained and knew what they were doing. I really like, okay, this is Concord Bridge today. Of course, it's not the original bridge. It's a reproduction of the bridge. There is the statue of the Minuteman statue, which is this. That's what it looks like today. Here's the fight at Concord Bridge, called the shot heard round the world. When the colonials fired back at the British, that was a shot heard round the world. But I like this drawing much better. This is the retreat of the British back to Boston. Oh my goodness. We hear about Lexington and Concord, but we don't hear about the retreat of the British back to Boston. 15 miles of ambush is what they faced. There were multiple battles. The British commander would disconnect or separate a company and tell them to go after those militia. And they would. They'd run off to the side, chase them away. But what good would it do? As soon as that British company came back to the road, more militia came after them. And so they were under constant attack all the way back. I think this really does a good job of showing it. Here's the column of British troops. Here's a company of militia. Here's a company of militia. Here's a company of militia. Here's more British troops firing at these guys. Here's a single rifleman right here. Here's a single rifleman right here. That's what they faced all the way back to Boston. We hear about the battles of Lexington and Concord, but, I gotta go back. Do we ever hear of the Battle of Monotamy? Have you ever heard of the Battle of Monotamy? Probably not. This was the hardest fight they faced on the retreat. By the time they got to Lexington, I need to put this in. Remember, there were 700 coming back, but remember earlier in the morning they called for reinforcements? General Gage sent 1,000 troops to reinforce them. They met them in Lexington. So now there's 1,700 British, but guess what? There's 4,000 militia all along the road. In Monotamy, they get into a street fight. It's hand-to-hand combat. At the Jason Russell house, 11 militiamen decide to take up a stand inside Jason's house, Jason Russell's house. The British surround the house, they break into the house, they bayonet all 11 of them. It's getting really bad. The British are frustrated, they're angry, they've marched 20 miles, and they're being sharpshooted the whole way. Monotamy is the worst fight of the retreat. There's a fellow by the name of Whitmore. He was 78 years old. He decided that he wanted to fight the British too. So he had a musket, he had 2 pistols and a sword, and he went out in his front yard. So the British going by saw him, so they sent a squad of men to take care of him. He shot 3 of them, 1 with a musket, 1 each with the pistols, killed all 3 of them. And he was ready with his sword, and they shot him in the face, and then they bayoneted him like 4 times. Oh no. When the Patriots, the militia, found him later, he was trying to load his musket. He lived till he was 98. So that's the Battle of Monotamy. Now, they kept up the retreat under fire the whole way. The Americans, or the colonists, believed that they would retreat back across Boston Neck. So they set up an ambush outside of Cambridge with about 2,000 militia, with the idea that these British had marched almost 30 miles under fire. They were out of ammunition, they were out of food, they were out of water, they were in very desperate shape, and the American militia believed that they would have to surrender if they could cut them off before they get to Boston. But the British commander was pretty smart. There was a road up here, you can't see it, but it led over to here and down to Charleston. So he took that road unexpectedly, and saved the British troops by going to Charleston, where they were under the protection of the British fleet in Boston Harbor. The next day, General Gage was able to ferry them back into Boston. The amazing thing about this whole thing to me, and there are so many, if you look at the history of the American Revolution, there are so many amazing things that happened during the American Revolution that make you want to say it was meant to be. That should never have happened. That made no sense. The only reason that could happen is because it was meant to be. And one of them happened at the end of this campaign by the British. The Americans were militia. They were farmers. They were shopkeepers. They weren't soldiers. And you would think, okay, the British got away. They're back in Boston. Everything's the way it was 2 days ago. Let's go back to our farms. Let's go back to our families. They didn't do it. They stayed right outside of Boston. They stayed right in this area. They didn't go home. 3 days later, the 4,000 militia that were here became 18,000 militia. And they were the beginnings of what would be the American Army, the Continental Line. It's called the Continental Troops. They were under the command of Artemus Ward. I got to go this way. And 2 months later, they would conduct the Battle of Bunker Hill. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British sent 3,000 troops to take Bunker Hill, where the Americans, with 2,400 men, had dug entrenchments. The British underestimated the Americans, and the Americans decimated them. Of the 3,000 troops, British troops that attacked Bunker Hill, they lost over 1,000 troops, over a third of the force. They did win the battle, and they took the entrenchments. That was one of the problems the British had. They had the impression that these are not professional soldiers, so they're not going to be able to stand up to a professional army. But they did on many occasions. Shouldn't have happened, but it did. The new American Congress in Philadelphia hired George Washington to command that army in Boston. I like this portrait of Washington. We have a tendency to see Washington when he was president. An old fellow, like me, white hair. This is Washington at 43 years old in 1772. This is what he would have looked like when he took command of the American Army at Boston in 1775. This is what he would have looked like. And I think that is so important that you see that. So that's what you need to think of as George Washington at the time. Wrong way. Wrong way. I'll get it. I don't think we have time to do this, but I do have to tell you very quickly. Why? Why is the American Revolution continuing? And the American Revolution is continuing because, let me get it. It's at the end. The American Revolution is not over. Remember I said American Revolution versus American Revolutionary War? The American Revolutionary War ended in 1783. The American Revolution still continues. Why? Because the American experience and the American experiment in self-government is still ongoing. It's still continuing. When you hear in the news about the Supreme Court's doing this, or the President's doing that, or the Congress is doing this, and the interchange of those and the conflicts, that is the American experiment underway. That's what it's all about. And really what it's all about, if you look at the ideals of the founding of America, as found in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When you look at those ideals that date back 2,000 years, this is the first nation founded on those ideals in history. That's the Declaration of Independence, leading to the Constitution and the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So when you get frustrated with what's happening in our country, remember, it's an experiment, and it's still underway. Okay? The struggle for human relevance and dignity continues. It still continues. I got to read this, Margie. I'm sorry. The United States of America is an ongoing experiment in government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That experiment has been underway for 250 years. That experiment can succeed or it can yet fail. It can yet fail. Although the American Revolutionary War ended in 1783, the American Revolution continues. We, of this generation, our children, our grandchildren, and their heirs, are the continental line of the 21st century and beyond. We today advance the colors of the movement of the relevance and the dignity of the individual human spirit and the rights of man as proposed by John Locke and so eloquently expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Or we let them fall into the soiled and bloody mud of totalitarianism, to be trampled and desecrated. As it was up to our forefathers to pass those colors to us, it is up to us to pass them on to the next generation. The success of the experiment depends on us. That's the American Revolution. The American Revolution continues. Thank you.